During the harsh winter months of 1878, a temporary educator in Cedar Creek, Indiana, uncovered a revelation that would torment the Methodist congregation for countless years to come. Over the span of 2 years, 50 young souls had disappeared from the town's cherished Sunday school initiative, youngsters whose names were documented in attendance logs, yet their families appeared to have completely erased their memory of these children's existence. The horrifying discovery she made concealed under the church's wooden floor planks would expose such methodical terror that local officials buried the proof for many decades. This evening, we reveal the reality behind Cedar Creek's most guarded mystery. Before we proceed with Margaret Wilson's tale and the children who entrusted her with their existence, this content isn't suitable for all viewers, only those courageous enough to face the most sinister aspects of America's religious past. If you're prepared to listen to narratives that few content creators would dare share, press that subscribe option and comment below indicating which state you're tuning in from. Do you possess the bravery to learn what truly transpired in that Methodist church cellar? The probe that ensued would reveal not merely personal wickedness, but an entire town's readiness to ignore inconvenient realities, and a criminal organization that had been functioning throughout the Midwest for more than 10 years. Cedar Creek was situated in the center of Indiana's mining region, where Methodist beliefs ran as profoundly as the mine tunnels that created a honeycomb pattern beneath the ground. By 1876, the settlement claimed nearly 3,000 residents, predominantly devout families, attracted by guarantees of reliable employment in the growing railway stations and mining operations that linked Indiana's natural resources to Chicago's demanding markets. The Baltimore and Ohio Railway had arrived in Cedar Creek during 1871, converting what had previously been a quiet agricultural town into a thriving center of trade and manufacturing. The community's swift expansion created difficulties that challenged the social structure of traditional country living. Irish and German newcomers arrived each week seeking employment in the mines and rail facilities, their Catholic and Lutheran beliefs generating friction with the established Protestant majority. Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches competed not only for congregants but for social power in a town where religious membership frequently determined business opportunities and social position. The original Methodist sanctuary stood as the town's most prized possession, a spectacular building constructed from Indiana limestone featuring dual bell towers audible for miles throughout the surrounding farmland. Finished in 1874, using contributions from wealthy traders and mine proprietors, the structure symbolized Methodist goals for cultural dominance in the rapidly transforming community. Its Gothic Revival design, stained glass panels imported from Cincinnati, and steam heating infrastructure marked it as Hamilton County's most advanced religious establishment. Sunday mornings in Cedar Creek featured crowded pews and children's voices lifted in hymns. However, it was the church's Sunday school initiative that truly distinguished First Methodist from neighboring denominations. Led by instructor Margaret Wilson, a stern-looking woman of 42 who had relocated from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, the program had expanded from a small group of local youngsters to more than 200 participants from surrounding counties. Families traveled their children from distances up to 20 miles, enduring challenging wagon journeys over muddy paths to join what had become famous throughout central Indiana. Margaret Wilson earned respect through a blend of scriptural expertise, firm discipline, and an evident talent for converting even the most difficult children into exemplary citizens. Her experience teaching in Philadelphia's industrial schools had provided her with knowledge of children from various backgrounds, and she appeared to have a natural understanding of how to connect with young minds, regardless of their family situations or inherent abilities. Her aide, Sarah Coleman, a gentle-spoken woman of 38 who had remained unmarried, seemed to have an almost mystical capacity to soothe even the most restless child with her soft voice and patient approach. Sarah had joined the program 2 years following Margaret's arrival, coming from a Methodist mission in Cincinnati where she had worked with orphaned youngsters. Her recommendations were flawless, and her commitment to the children's well-being seemed complete. Both women were overseen by Robert Hayes, a wealthy businessman in his 50s who contributed generously to expand the church's educational resources. Hayes possessed investments in 3 coal mines, 2 grain storage facilities, and the town's largest general store. His appointment to the church board had been unanimous, and his financial support had funded not only building enhancements but also the creative educational programs that were attracting families from throughout the region. What made Cedar Creek's Sunday School famous across Hamilton County were the special biblical expeditions, educational journeys that combined scripture study with visits to historical locations throughout Indiana and neighboring states. These weren't simple afternoon outings, but detailed week-long adventures that promised to make Bible stories come alive through visits to museums, historic churches, archaeological locations, and even meetings with prominent Methodist educators and missionaries. The program's fame had spread through word of mouth and occasional articles in Methodist publications that commended Cedar Creek's innovative approach to religious education. Parents throughout the region competed to have their children chosen for these prestigious expeditions, which were presented as once-in-a-lifetime opportunities for young minds to expand beyond the constraints of rural existence. The Methodist denomination's focus on education and social betterment made such programs not only acceptable but celebrated throughout Protestant America. Since John Wesley's founding principles had stressed the significance of learning and personal growth, Methodist churches were expected to offer educational opportunities that extended beyond simple Bible study. In an era when most children received limited formal schooling, the promise of educational travel represented an exceptional opportunity for families of modest means. Margaret Wilson's reputation for transforming rebellious children into model citizens only enhanced the program's attractiveness. She had arrived in Cedar Creek with recommendation letters from Methodist leaders in Philadelphia, where her work in industrial schools had gained recognition for reducing juvenile crime in some of the city's most challenging neighborhoods. Methods, which emphasized discipline combined with broadened perspectives, seemed perfectly suited to the needs of a frontier community struggling with the social changes brought by rapid industrial development. The timing of the program's establishment had been ideal. The financial crisis of 1873 had left many families struggling economically, making the promise of educational opportunities for their children particularly appealing. Parents who could barely afford basic necessities viewed Margaret Wilson's program as a means to provide their children with advantages they could never offer themselves. The fact that these opportunities came through the church gave them additional legitimacy and moral authority. Cedar Creek's Methodist congregation included many of the town's most successful citizens, mine owners, merchants, railroad officials, and prosperous farmers whose support lent credibility to any church-sponsored activity. When such respected community members endorsed the educational program and spoke proudly of their own children's participation, it became nearly impossible for other parents to voice doubts or concerns without appearing ungrateful or suspicious of beneficial community initiatives. The program's expansion beyond Cedar Creek had been gradual but intentional. Margaret Wilson had established contacts with Methodist churches and smaller surrounding communities, offering to include their children in the expeditions as a service to rural families who lacked access to such educational opportunities. This regional approach not only increased the pool of potential participants, but also made it more difficult for any single community to track patterns or maintain oversight of the program's activities. The first disappearance happened in September 1876, though nobody termed it a disappearance at that time. 80-year-old Timothy Morrison had been selected for a special expedition to study ancient biblical practices at a newly discovered archaeological location near Louisville. His parents, recent German immigrants who spoke limited English and worked in Hayes's newest coal mine, received Margaret Wilson's explanation with grateful acknowledgement and tears of happiness. Timothy had demonstrated exceptional promise in his brief months attending Sunday school, showing an unusual ability to memorize scripture and ask thoughtful questions about biblical stories. Margaret Wilson explained that his intellectual talents had attracted the attention of a Methodist family in Kentucky who specialized in biblical archaeology and ancient studies. They had specifically requested a bright young student to assist with their research while receiving advanced education that would prepare him for possible missionary work or religious scholarship. The opportunity was presented as a rare honor that reflected not just Timothy's abilities, but the quality of Cedar Creek's educational program. The Morrison family would receive regular updates on their son's progress, and Timothy would return, after 2 years, with knowledge and connections that could transform his life. Prospects for parents who had immigrated to America hoping to give their children better opportunities than they had known in Germany. The offer seemed like an answer to their prayers. Timothy's departure barely registered in the community consciousness. The Morrison family seemed proud rather than concerned, and Margaret Wilson's detailed letter explaining the opportunity convinced even skeptical neighbors that the boy had simply been blessed with an extraordinary chance for advancement. The fact that Timothy had always been somewhat quiet and studious made his absence less noticeable among his peer group. 2 weeks later, 10-year-old Mary Catherine Phillips joined an expedition focused on missionary work among distant communities. Her widowed mother, who struggled to support 3 children on the small income from taking in laundry, received assurances that Mary Catherine would be learning valuable skills while helping to establish Sunday schools in newly settled territories. The girl's obvious intelligence and leadership qualities made her selection seem not just reasonable but inevitable. Mary Catherine had been one of the most popular children in the Sunday school program, known for her ability to help younger children with their lessons and her enthusiastic participation in all activities. Margaret Wilson explained that a Methodist mission organization in Illinois had specifically requested a capable young girl to assist with their work among families moving west. Mary Catherine would receive training in teaching methods while helping to spread Methodist education to frontier communities that lacked established churches. The promise of regular correspondence and eventual return was accompanied by the suggestion that Mary Catherine's experience could lead to a position as a professional teacher or missionary, careers that would provide financial security and social respectability far beyond what her current circumstances might offer. For a widow facing an uncertain future, the opportunity seemed like divine providence. By Christmas of 1876, 6 more children had departed on various educational expeditions. Each departure followed the same careful pattern: selection based on demonstrated merit, detailed explanations of educational opportunities, promises of correspondence that somehow never quite materialized, and reassurances that any lack of communication simply reflected the children's deep immersion in their studies. What made this systematic disappearance possible was a calculated methodology that had nothing to do with educational merit or spiritual development. The genius of Margaret Wilson's system lay in its exploitation of parental aspirations and social expectations. In a community where educational opportunity was scarce and upward mobility rare, the chance for a child to advance through church connections represented a family's greatest hope. To question such opportunities would have seemed not just ungrateful but potentially damaging to other children's prospects within the program. As Ellen Hartwell would later discover, the selection of children for the excursions followed a calculated methodology that had nothing to do with educational merit or spiritual development. Margaret Wilson and Sarah Coleman had developed a systematic approach to identifying the most vulnerable and valuable candidates for their criminal enterprise. Their primary criteria focused on family circumstances that would make disappearances less likely to trigger immediate investigation. Children from immigrant families were preferred because language barriers and cultural differences made parents less likely to question authority figures or navigate complex inquiries about their children's whereabouts. Recent arrivals to the community were particularly valuable because they lacked established social networks that might notice and investigate unexplained absences. Economic desperation played a crucial role in the selection process. Families struggling financially were more likely to be grateful for opportunities and less likely to ask difficult questions that might jeopardize their children's apparent good fortune. Widowed mothers, large families with limited resources, and parents working in dangerous occupations that could leave children orphaned at any time were all considered ideal candidates. The children themselves were evaluated based on their potential market value in the criminal networks that Margaret Wilson had cultivated over years of careful development. Younger boys with strong builds were destined for industrial work in factories and mines, where their small size and developing strength could be exploited without immediate health consequences. Older girls with pleasant appearances and basic education commanded premium prices in domestic service markets that, Ellen would later learn, extended far beyond legitimate household employment. Intelligence was actually considered a liability in some cases, as brighter children were more likely to resist indoctrination, attempt escape, or find ways to communicate with their families. Margaret Wilson preferred children who were bright enough to be valuable but compliant enough to be manageable. The Sunday school program provided an excellent laboratory for observing children's personalities and identifying those most suitable for different types of exploitation. Sarah Coleman's role in this evaluation process proved crucial. Her gentle manner and obvious affection for the children gave her access to intimate details about their fears, hopes, and family relationships. She would spend hours in private conversation with potential candidates, ostensibly providing pastoral care and educational guidance, but actually gathering intelligence that would determine their ultimate fate. The winter of 1876–77 marked a significant expansion in the scope of the operation. Margaret Wilson had established connections with similar programs in Methodist churches throughout Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, creating a regional network that could move children across state lines and make tracking infinitely more difficult. This expansion had been carefully planned to coincide with increased railroad connectivity that made long-distance travel both easier and less conspicuous. Robert Hayes's business connections proved invaluable in facilitating this expansion. His involvement in railroad shipping and grain trading had given him contacts throughout the Midwest, many of whom were willing to assist with discreet transportation arrangements in exchange for favorable business terms. The legitimate cover provided by his various enterprises made it possible to move children across multiple states without arousing suspicion from law enforcement or railroad officials. The financial returns from the operation had exceeded all expectations, generating enough revenue to fund significant expansions of the church's facilities and educational programs. This created a virtuous cycle from the conspirators' perspective. Their criminal profits funded improvements that attracted more families and provided better cover for their activities. The new church basement facilities, funded by Hayes's donations, included private rooms and storage areas that facilitated their operations. By spring 1877, the program was handling children from over 12 different communities, with some families traveling more than 30 miles to participate in Cedar Creek's renowned educational offerings. This geographic spread made it virtually impossible for any single community to notice patterns or maintain oversight of the program's activities. Parents in different towns rarely communicated with each other, and the prestige associated with selection for the excursions discouraged questioning that might seem to challenge the program's integrity. But the true architect of this deception would prove to be someone far more calculating than anyone suspected. The success of the operation attracted attention from criminal networks in major cities, who were eager to establish reliable sources for child labor. Margaret Wilson's reputation for delivering healthy, educated, and properly conditioned children had spread through underground channels, leading to advance orders and premium pricing that transformed what had begun as opportunistic crime into systematic human trafficking. Sarah Coleman's personal journal, which Ellen Hartwell would eventually discover, revealed the psychological sophistication that made the operation possible. Unlike Margaret Wilson, whose motivations appeared primarily financial, Sarah demonstrated a disturbing fascination with the process of psychological manipulation itself. Her detailed observations of each child's personality, fears, and weaknesses read like clinical studies in human behavior. The journal contained disturbing passages about conditioning children for their eventual destinations. Sarah had developed techniques for gradually separating children from family attachments, identifying which children would adapt best to different types of work, and developing strategies to prevent rebellion or escape attempts. Her apparent affection for the children masked a calculating assessment of their commercial potential and psychological vulnerabilities. One particularly chilling entry described her work with 12-year-old Anna Kowalski, whose selection for a special missionary training program had been celebrated by her Polish immigrant parents as divine blessing. Sarah's notes detailed how she had gradually convinced Anna that her family's poverty and foreign background made them unsuitable guardians for a child with such exceptional spiritual gifts. By the time Anna departed for her supposed missionary training, she had been convinced that serving God required her to abandon her former life entirely. Sarah's methods extended beyond individual manipulation to encompass systematic deception of the broader community. She had crafted a carefully managed correspondence system that created the illusion of ongoing contact with departed children while actually providing no genuine communication at all. Parents received periodic updates written in Sarah's hand but supposedly dictated by their children, describing progress in their studies and expressing gratitude for the opportunities they were receiving. These fabricated letters served multiple purposes. They reassured parents and prevented persistent inquiries that might lead to investigation. They provided seemingly innocent explanations for the children's continued absence and apparent reluctance to return home. Most importantly, they created a paper trail that could be used to justify the program's activities if questions were ever raised by outside authorities. The sophistication of Sarah's psychological manipulation extended to her relationships with other adults in the community. She had identified key individuals whose support was crucial for maintaining the program's reputation and had developed specific strategies for managing each relationship. Her journal contained detailed profiles of community leaders, noting their personal ambitions, family vulnerabilities, and business interests that could be leveraged to maintain their cooperation. In January 1878, tragedy struck the regular teaching staff when Sarah Coleman fell ill with what the local doctor diagnosed as consumption. The timing was particularly unfortunate, as the program was preparing for its most ambitious series of excursions, yet a coordinated effort that would place nearly 30 children in various locations across the Midwest before the spring planting season made travel more difficult. Sarah's illness created a crisis for the operation. Her intimate knowledge of each child's psychological profile and her carefully cultivated relationships with parents made her irreplaceable in the short term. Margaret Wilson found herself overwhelmed by administrative duties that had previously been shared, while Robert Hayes pressured her to maintain the program schedule despite the staffing shortage. The church board's decision to hire 24-year Ellen Hartwell as a temporary replacement was based primarily on her recent graduation from the Indiana State Normal School and her impressive credentials as a trained educator. What the conspirators failed to anticipate was that Elon's professional training had taught her the importance of detailed record-keeping and systematic educational assessment skills that would prove fatal to their carefully constructed deception. Elon had grown up in a Methodist family in southern Indiana, where her father served as a circuit preacher and her mother taught in various church schools. Her decision to pursue formal education training had been motivated by a desire to improve the quality of religious education available to rural children. She arrived in Cedar Creek with genuine enthusiasm for the program's apparent innovations and high reputation throughout the Methodist community. However, Ellen's professional training would soon lead her to notice discrepancies that others had overlooked. Her first weeks in the position seemed to confirm everything she had heard about the program's quality and effectiveness. The children who remained in regular attendance were indeed well-behaved, knowledgeable about Scripture, and enthusiastic about their studies. The facilities were modern and well-equipped, and the community support for the program was evident in both financial contributions and parental participation. But Ellen's professional training had taught her to look beyond surface appearances and evaluate educational programs based on measurable outcomes and systematic documentation. Her requests to review assessment records, correspondence files, and long-term tracking data were initially deflected by Margaret Wilson with explanations about the unique nature of their program and the confidential relationships they maintained with host families. Ellen's first serious concerns arose when she attempted to prepare lesson plans that would build upon the previous year's curriculum. The absence of detailed records about what children had studied before their departure made it impossible to ensure continuity in the education of their siblings and classmates who remained in the program. When she raised these concerns with Margaret Wilson, she was told that the departed children's studies had been so specialized that their curriculum bore little relationship to the regular Sunday school program. More troubling still, when Ellen casually mentioned some of the missing children in conversations with longtime church members, she was met with confused looks and vague responses. It was as if the community had collectively forgotten these young souls had ever existed. Parents who had once proudly spoken of their children's educational opportunities now seemed reluctant to discuss the subject at all. Changing the conversation, when Ellen attempted to ask about letters or updates from their absent children, Ellen's professional training had included instruction in recognizing signs of educational fraud and institutional abuse, problems that were becoming increasingly common as demand for educational services outpaced the supply of qualified providers. The pattern she observed in Cedar Creek matched several warning signs she had been taught to identify: vague record-keeping, reluctance to provide documentation, defensive responses to reasonable questions, and systematic isolation of program participants from outside oversight. Her first direct confrontation with Margaret Wilson came in February 1878. Ellen had prepared a letter to send to the families hosting the children on extended excursions, hoping to establish correspondence between the young students and their former classmates. Such communication was standard practice in legitimate educational exchange programs and served important purposes in maintaining emotional connections and assessing student progress. Margaret's reaction was swift and severe. Such contact would disrupt the children's studies and potentially undermine their host's authority. The families hosting the children had specifically requested minimal outside interference to allow the students to fully immerse themselves in their new educational environments. Ellen was forbidden from any communication regarding the absent students and warned that further interference could jeopardize her position and the program's carefully cultivated relationships. The substitute teacher's suspicions deepened when she discovered that none of the churches or educational institutions supposedly hosting the children had ever heard of the Cedar Creek program. Letters sent to Methodist congregations in cities where children had reportedly been placed returned with polite but confused responses. No one had any record of Cedar Creek students or educational exchanges. Ellen's investigation took a crucial turn when she began examining the financial records associated with the educational program. As a trained educator, she understood that legitimate educational exchanges typically involve detailed financial arrangements, insurance considerations, and contractual agreements between participating institutions. The absence of such documentation in Cedar Creek's files seemed increasingly suspicious. Robert Hayes's role in financing the program had always been presented as straightforward philanthropy, a successful businessman supporting community education through generous donations. But Ellen's examination of church financial records revealed a more complex pattern of transactions that seemed inconsistent with simple charitable giving. Large sums of money moved in and out of program accounts with no clear documentation of their purpose or destination. More troubling still were the personal financial changes Ellen observed in the program's leadership. Margaret Wilson had purchased substantial property in Cedar Creek and was reportedly considering investments in California real estate. Sarah Coleman, despite her modest teacher's salary, had accumulated enough savings to afford extended medical treatment in Chicago. Robert Hayes had expanded his business operations significantly, opening new stores in neighboring towns and purchasing additional mining interests. The collective wealth accumulation among the program's leadership seemed far beyond what their legitimate incomes could support. Ellen's father's experience as a circuit preacher had given her familiarity with the typical financial circumstances of Methodist educators and church officials. The prosperity displayed by Cedar Creek's educational leadership was unprecedented in her experience and inconsistent with their supposed dedication to humble service. Ellen's growing unease reached a breaking point when she overheard a conversation between Margaret Wilson and Robert Hayes in the church basement following a Wednesday evening service. Their hushed tones and frequent references to shipments, accounts, and contacts in Chicago seemed entirely inconsistent with educational programming. The fragments of conversation she caught suggested coordination of transportation, discussion of prices, and concerns about maintaining schedules that sounded more like commercial transactions than educational planning. On the night of March 15, 1878, Ellen Hartwell made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Using her key to the church educational wing, she entered the building long after evening services had concluded. The basement rooms that served as Sunday school classrooms during winter months held secrets she was determined to uncover, regardless of the personal risk or professional consequences. The church basement at night was a maze of shadows and strange sounds. The building's steam heating system created mysterious noises, and the winter wind rattled windows and doors throughout the structure. Ellen's single oil lamp provided barely enough light to navigate the familiar classrooms that seemed transformed and threatening in the darkness. Her hands shook as she began her systematic search of Margaret Wilson's private office. What she found beneath a loose floorboard in Margaret Wilson's private office defied every assumption about the woman's character and motives. A leather-bound ledger contained meticulous records spanning 2 full years. But these weren't educational records, they were business transactions, documented with the precision of a commercial enterprise and the cold calculation of systematic exploitation. Each missing child was listed with their age, physical description, family background, and what Ellen gradually realized were sales prices. Timothy Morrison, age 8, sturdy build, docile temperament, German family with limited English, had been sold for $85 to what the ledger cryptically referred to as Chicago textile interests. Mary Catherine Phillips, described as age 10, intelligent, leadership qualities, widowed mother financially desperate, commanded $120 from Louisville Domestic Services. The entries grew more horrific as Ellen read deeper into the ledger. Children were categorized by their perceived value in different markets. Younger boys went to factories and mines where their small size and developing strength could be exploited. Older girls to domestic service that Ellen feared meant something far worse than legitimate housework. The ledger contained addresses in Chicago, Louisville, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, along with coded references to contacts who could arrange transportation and provide documentation. Most chilling of all were the financial summaries. Over 2 years, Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes had generated over $4,000 in documented revenue from the systematic sale of children, more money than most Cedar Creek families would see in a lifetime. Additional notations suggested this represented only the recorded transactions, with hints of off-books arrangements that could have doubled or tripled their actual profits. The basement yielded additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of the operation's scope and sophistication. Ellen discovered forged letters supposedly written by the missing children, describing happy lives with their new families and expressing gratitude for the opportunities they were receiving. These carefully crafted deceptions had been shown to any parent who became too persistent in their inquiries about their children's welfare. The handwriting was consistent across all the letters, clearly the work of one person creating fictional accounts of children's well-being. The content followed similar patterns, emphasizing how much the children were learning, how grateful they were for their opportunities, and how important it was that they focus on their studies without distractions from their previous lives. Several letters specifically discouraged parents from attempting to visit or maintain regular correspondence. In a locked drawer, Ellen found what appeared to be contracts with various industrial operations and domestic service agencies. The language was carefully coded, but the intent was unmistakable. These were purchase agreements for child labor, arranged through a network of accomplices who had turned human trafficking into a profitable business model. The contracts specified delivery dates, payment terms, and even return policies for children who proved unsuitable for their intended work. The most damning evidence came in the form of correspondence between Margaret Wilson and her contacts in major cities. Letters detailed the specific requirements of various employers, their preferences for children of certain ages, their willingness to pay premium prices for particularly promising students, and their assurances of discretion in handling the arrangements. The correspondence revealed a sophisticated network that extended far beyond Indiana, with connections to similar operations in multiple states. One letter from a Chicago factory owner praised Margaret for the quality of merchandise she provided, noting that Cedar Creek children adapted well to industrial work and caused fewer problems than children acquired through other sources. The letter included specific requests for the next shipment, with detailed specifications for age ranges, physical capabilities, and personality traits that would be most suitable for the factory's operations. Another letter from what appeared to be a Louisville establishment that Ellen did not fully contemplate requested specifically girls between ages 12 to 14 with pleasant demeanor and basic education. The coded language could not disguise the horrific implications of such requests, and Ellen realized that some of the children she had known and taught were likely trapped in situations far worse than industrial exploitation. The systematic nature of the operation became terrifyingly clear as Ellen continued her investigation throughout the night. Margaret Wilson had identified Cedar Creek's Methodist community as an ideal hunting ground, parents trusting enough to surrender their children, isolated enough to prevent easy investigation, and aspirational enough to believe in promises of educational advancement. The church's reputation and the educators standing in the community provided perfect cover for what amounted to systematic child trafficking. The correspondence revealed that the Cedar Creek operation was part of a much larger network spanning multiple states. Margaret Wilson maintained regular contact with similar operations in Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, sharing information about successful techniques, profitable markets, and law enforcement risks. The network had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with specialized roles, established transportation routes, and coordinated timing that maximized profits while minimizing risks. Regional coordination allowed the network to respond quickly to market demands and law enforcement pressures. If investigations threatened one location, children could be rapidly moved to other parts of the network until the danger passed. The correspondence showed that Cedar Creek had served as a temporary refuge for children from operations that had been compromised in other states, while also sending its own victims to safer locations when local pressures increased. But perhaps most horrifying was the discovery of Sarah Coleman's personal journal, hidden behind a false wall in the basement. storage room. The gentlewoman who had seemed so genuinely caring revealed herself as the operation's psychological architect, whose detailed observations of each child's personality, fears, and weaknesses had been used to determine their market value and appropriate placement. Sarah's journal contained disturbing passages about methodically breaking down children's resistance and family attachments. She had developed specific techniques for different types of children: how to convince intelligent children that compliance was their only option, how to use religious instruction to create guilt and submission, and how to identify and exploit each child's deepest fears to ensure cooperation during the transition to their new circumstances. The journal revealed that Sarah's apparent illness was likely fabricated to provide cover for the operation's final phase. Her medical treatment in Chicago was actually coordination with network partners to complete the largest transaction in the operation's history, a bulk sale of over 30 children to various industrial and domestic operations throughout the Midwest. Hidden among Sarah's papers, Ellen discovered something that chilled her more than all the financial records and correspondence. Combined, fragmentary testimonies from children who had attempted to escape or communicate with their families. These desperate messages had been intercepted and preserved, apparently as insurance against network partners who might consider betraying the operation. One note, written in a child's careful handwriting, read, "Mama, they told me you didn't want me anymore because I was bad. I work in the big building with the loud machines. My hands hurt all the time and I'm so tired. Please come get me. I promise I'll be good." The note was marked with an address in Chicago and a notation indicating it had been intercepted before delivery. Another fragment, apparently torn from a larger letter, contained a girl's plea. "The lady here says I have to be grateful for my food and bed, but she makes me do things that feel wrong. I remember what you taught me about right and wrong, but she says God wants me to obey. I'm scared and I want to come home." The handwriting was identified in Sarah's careful notation as belonging to Mary Catherine Phillips's. These testimonies revealed the psychological warfare that accompanied the physical exploitation. Children were systematically convinced that their families had abandoned them, that their suffering was deserved punishment for unspecified sins, and that submission to their circumstances was both inevitable and morally required. The religious framework that had initially attracted their families was perverted into a tool for maintaining control and preventing resistance. As Ellen continued reading through the horrific documentation, she realized the conspirators were preparing to vanish entirely. Ellen realized that the children who had been sold were not just physically enslaved but psychologically broken in ways that would make rescue and recovery extraordinarily difficult. Even if law enforcement could locate and free them, the damage to their minds and spirits might never fully heal. The true scope of the crime extended far beyond the initial trafficking to encompass systematic psychological torture designed to destroy any hope of escape or recovery. The financial records revealed that the three conspirators had been preparing to abandon Cedar Creek entirely by the summer of 1878, taking their accumulated profits to California, where they planned to establish themselves under new identities. The timing was carefully calculated to coincide with the completion of their largest transaction and the implementation of new railroad schedules that would facilitate rapid travel westward. Margaret Wilson had already purchased property near San Francisco under an assumed name, while Robert Hayes had been liquidating his Indiana business interests and converting assets to portable forms that could be easily transported. Sarah Coleman's supposed illness provided cover for her gradual withdrawal from community obligations and preparation for departure. The final excursion would have netted them enough money to fund their escape and early retirement in comfortable circumstances. The plan's sophistication extended to detailed contingency preparations for various scenarios. If their activities were discovered before their departure, they had prepared false documentation, established escape routes, and identified criminal contacts who could provide assistance in avoiding law enforcement. The correspondence showed they had even considered eliminating potential witnesses who might threaten their escape. Ellen's discovery of these escape plans revealed the urgency of her situation. The conspirators were not planning a gradual withdrawal but a rapid abandonment that would leave their victims with no hope of rescue and no possibility of justice. The 23 children scheduled for the upcoming excursion were not just facing exploitation, but potential disappearance into a criminal network that spanned the continent. The realization that she was probably the only person who knew the truth and had access to evidence created a terrible burden of responsibility. Any delay in acting could result in the permanent loss of nearly 24 more children. While premature action might allow the conspirators to escape justice and continue their operations elsewhere, Ellen faced an impossible choice between children's immediate safety and the broader goal of exposing the entire network. Ellen's discovery of the evidence coincided with Margaret Wilson's announcement of the most ambitious excursion, yet a month-long trip to historical biblical sites, that would take 23 children as far as Philadelphia and possibly Boston. The timing was no coincidence. Ellen realized this represented the operation's final harvest before the conspirators disappeared with their accumulated profits. The substitute teacher faced an impossible choice. Local law enforcement included several men who owed their positions to Robert Hayes's political influence, and the Methodist Church hierarchy had invested considerable prestige in Cedar Creek's acclaimed educational program. Any accusation against such respected community figures would be met with skepticism at best, and more likely with charges of slander that could destroy her career and credibility. The children selected for the upcoming excursion represented a cross-section of the community's most vulnerable families. Ellen recognized names she had come to know during her months in Cedar Creek, bright, trusting students who had grown to love their classes and looked forward to what they believed would be the adventure of their lifetimes. She could not allow 23 or more children to disappear into the nightmare she had uncovered. The decision to act came when Ellen realized that Sarah Coleman's supposed departure for medical treatment in Chicago was actually the beginning of the operation's final phase. The timing of her illness corresponded exactly with the preparation for the largest transaction in the network's history. If Ellen waited for more evidence or attempted to work through official channels, it would be too late to prevent the systematic destruction of an entire generation of Cedar Creek's children. On March 28, 1878, Ellen Hartwell broke into the church basement one final time, not to gather evidence, but to steal it. She took the ledger, the correspondence, Sarah Coleman's journal, and every document that could prove the conspiracy's existence and scope. She knew that their disappearance would alert the conspirators to her discovery, but she hoped that documented proof would force authorities to act before the final excursion could depart. Her timing proved both fortunate and tragic. Margaret Wilson's immediate response to the missing evidence was to accelerate the final excursion, moving the departure date up by a full week and changing the announced destination to confuse any potential investigation. But Ellen's desperate, nighttime ride to the county seat in Noblesville, where she presented her evidence to Circuit Judge William Marshall, set in motion events that would finally bring justice to Cedar Creek. Judge Marshall's examination of Ellen's evidence left no room for doubt about the conspiracy's scope and horror. More importantly, his immediate telegrams to law enforcement in Chicago, Louisville, and other cities resulted in coordinated raids that rescued 11 children before they could be permanently lost in the urban underworld. The rescue operations revealed that the network extended even further than Ellen's evidence had suggested, with connections to criminal organizations throughout the Midwest and beyond. The arrest of Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes on March 30, 1878, sent shockwaves through Cedar Creek's Methodist community. The three conspirators were taken into custody as they attempted to board a westbound train with substantial amounts of cash and forged travel documents. Their capture revealed the final pieces of a puzzle that had taken Ellen months to assemble, but the deeper horror came with the realization that an entire town had somehow failed to notice the systematic disappearance of 50 children over 2 years. The subsequent investigation revealed the psychological manipulation that had made such massive deception possible. Parents had been